Hi everybody, I'm Brianna and I partnered with a local photographer and his 1902 wetplate camera to recreate the Cottingley Fairy Hoax photos exactly 101 years after the last photo was taken. I've been so enchanted by the Cottingley Fairies and these photos for almost my whole life, and I'm very excited to bring you this project. I think that the whole world has been enchanted by this story. The BBC has once called it the greatest hoax of the 20th century. This story is about two young girls who photograph themselves with fairies in the English countryside, and the entire world did believe that they were real. The origins of this story go back to 1917, but my story begins about 80 years later in 1997 when my dad took my little sister and I to go see the movie A Fairytale, A True Story. And last spring when I was going through some of my keepsakes, I discovered that I still had my movie ticket from that day, which is pretty wild because it was a long time ago. Finding that movie ticket really sparked my interest back into the story, and I did some research and found that the girls used a Butcher Midge Plate Camera that dates between 1902 and 1920, and it just so happens that the wet plate photographer that I work with, Ken, his camera is from 1902. And so I thought, wow, this is a pretty wild synchronicity, and so I reached out to him to see if he'd be willing to recreate these photos with me, and he said yes, and so that is how we got to recreate these photos using a very, very similar camera from the same time period as the Cottingley Fairy photos. I've split this video into 3 parts. Part 1 is going to be the folklore of the story, Part 2 is going to be the process of preparing for the photo shoot, and Part 3 is going to be the photo shoot itself, which is very, very, very cool. So let's jump into Part 1. In 1917, 9-year-old Frances Griffiths traveled to the English countryside to visit with her 16-year-old cousin Elsie Wright. The girls were known to tell stories about the fairies in their garden and their forest, and so they took a photo to prove their existence. They took one photo in July 1917 and another photo later that September. When Elsie's parents saw these photos, they thought that they looked so very real, and in 1919, Elsie's mother took the photos to a convention that was going on about fairies, and she had some experts analyze the photos, and the experts did feel that they were authentic and real. The photos actually caught the attention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. The girls were asked to take 3 more photos, and so on August 19th, 1920, they took those photos, and they were later published in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's book, The Coming of the Fairies, in 1922. Decades later, in 1983, the girls, now much older in their age, admitted that the fairies in the photos were not real, and that the whole thing just kind of grew into something much bigger than they had ever intended.
After Frances had claimed she'd seen fairies up the beck, both girls were teased by the adults. Elsie hit on a scheme to stop the teasing.
Elsa said one night, we were getting ready for bed, she said, what about if I draw some fairies and cut them out in cardboard, and we'll stick them up in the grass and see if Uncle and Dad will have the camera and we'll take a photograph. So if they see them, they'll have to believe it, they'll stop all this joking.
Elsie said that she was inspired by a book called Princess Mary's Gift Book that had a poem called A Spell for a Fairy. Elsie drew the photos, made cutouts, and attached hat pins to the back of the fairies to position them in the photos.
I said, with the long hat pin, we put it down the back like that. The thing was that they could see them, that the fairies were moving when the photograph was taken, but that's because they did it in the breeze.
I love that their inspiration was a poem called A Spell for the Fairies, because this entire story and these fairies actually did cast a spell on the whole world. Many articles have called this story a beacon of hope and magic, and that is because during the time that these photos were taken, there was a world war happening, and so people just really wanted something beautiful and hopeful to believe in and dream about. And so I think that's one of the reasons that this story unintentionally became as big as it did. So let's move on to part 2, the process of preparing for the photo shoot. Before we could take the photos, I of course had to make my fairies, and like the girls, I chose fairy artwork that was really inspiring to me, and so I chose to use Cicely Mary Barker's flower fairies for my fairies. I have always loved the flower fairy artwork. I scanned the fairies that I loved and that resembled the original fairies, and so I ended up making the same fairies in several different sizes so that we could see what worked best on the wet plate film. So you can see I made 2 different sizes of my lavender fairy, and for each photo that we took, we ended up using the larger sized fairy. For some of my fairies, I attached wire to the back or some wrapping so that I could wrap them around trees, and I didn't have hat pins, so I just kind of used what I had. And then I really wanted to add texture and flowers to the fairies because wet plates really pick up texture. And so I added these real dried flowers to my fairies. Some of them had lavender or daisies, and I also had a pansy fairy. So now let's go into part 3, the photo shoot, which is so exciting. I'm really excited to show you all of this footage. We did our photo shoot on July 16th, 2021, which is almost exactly 101 years after the last fairy photo was taken, and the very first photo was actually taken in July 1917. So I really love that kind of time alignment. We used a 1902 Century View wet plate camera for our photo shoot, which takes black and white pictures on glass or tin, and you have to develop them on the spot. So Ken has a portable black room. It's actually a van that he's converted into a black room. Luckily, Ken and I have worked together before, so we have an understanding of each other's creative process, and so we had that really going for us. Without realizing it at the time, we ended up taking our photos in the exact same order that the girls took their photos in, but in my mind, I wanted to start with the most difficult photo first, and that was the group fairy photo. So the original photo was taken in front of a waterfall, and we didn't have access to a waterfall, and it was also summertime, so we took this photo in my enchanted forest, and we placed the fairies on moss rocks in front of me, and that way we had more control over the height of the fairies. For this photo, my friend made me a flower crown, and between the flower crown and my outfit, the vibes of this photo were very folklore and very midsummer. I really felt like an extra out of Midsummer, and so there were some serious Ari Aster vibes going on, and I kind of really loved that. And the photo itself ended up feeling very folklore. It was extremely difficult to get this photo. We ended up having to take 2 wet plates because the lighting was really difficult, and so we had to play around with the exposure. So this photo actually took a couple hours to get. The photo that turned out the best is the one that had the longest exposure time, and I think it was around 1 minute and 30 seconds, meaning I couldn't move for 1 minute and 30 seconds. I really love though that there's almost like this movement in my fairies, so it does actually look like they're dancing. My fairies showed up a lot smaller. I didn't realize how big the girls' fairies were, and to be honest, if fairies were that big, they wouldn't be so elusive. So I feel like in hindsight, the size of the fairies in that photo is kind of a telltale sign that they weren't real. So the second photo that we took was the second photo that the girls took in September of 1917, and this photo is of Elsie sitting in the grass with a gnome. I whipped up some magic and made the actual gnome that was in the original photo. I just resized the original photo and cut the gnome and worked a little bit of computer magic, and so I made 2 different sizes. And of course we used the bigger size, which still ended up being a bit small. One of the things that's really interesting about this photo is that my hat is red, and when I went back and did more research after the photo shoot, the girls said that the gnome's hat was actually red in the photo, and so I think that's a really fun coincidence. This photo turned out so beautifully. The exposure, the lighting, everything was absolutely perfect, and it turned out really crisp, and I think that we couldn't have asked for a better result, and this ended up being Ken's favorite photo of the day. The next few photos were a part of that commission in August of 1920 for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and our third photo was my personal favorite photo of the photo shoot. I think that's because between my outfit and the way that the photo looks, it has a very Tuck Everlasting vibe, and so I really love that. This photo is of Frances sitting by a fairy really close to her face, and there's a lot of leaves and greenery in behind her, and so in order to create this, I needed to have something similar, and luckily for us, a tree had fallen in my yard a few days before. The first photo that we took was very bright, and so we wanted to try it with a shorter exposure time, but the first photo ended up being my personal favorite, and I think it's one of my most favorite photos that Ken and I have ever taken together. I also think that ours looks so similar to the original. I think that the 20s gnome photo and this photo were the ones that probably were the closest to the originals, and I'm very happy with how this one turned out. So the fourth photo that we took is the last fairy photo that we took, but the girls did take 5 photos. The setup for this photo was very similar, if not the same, as the one before it. I just took my hair down and we positioned the new fairy very close to my face, and the key was for me to look just past the fairy a little bit, and that was very important for the photo, the position of my eyes. I really like how this photo turned out because you can really see the texture in my face and in the photo, and I think that's really cool. This is the original. I think that our photo version of this ended up being the most different than the original, but it was a solid effort. We didn't take a lot of video for this this particular photo because we were very tired by the end of the day, but yeah, this photo turned out really cool. So the girls did take 5 photos, and the 5th photo does not include the girls. It's just actually something very mysterious, and it looks like some fairies doing something. The resources that I found online said that what's in the photo is some kind of fairy garment, like a sheath or a cover that they would wear, and it's become a bit of a symbol of kind of fairycore, like fairy culture, and I think that it's very interesting, the mystery surrounding it, and that the girls potentially had said that this was the only real photo. And I think that because of my experience with fairy magic, I think that it's very possible that these young girls had a real fairy spirit experience in their garden, but in order to convince the whole world that it was real, they went through this whole process, and so I think that this story is very cool. Thank you so much for coming on this fairy journey with me to rediscover the magic of the Cottingley Fairies and of this really beautiful and hopeful story, and thank you to Ken, of course, for helping me to recreate these photos. These photo shoots are a lot of work, and I so appreciate it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Look what I just found. Hello?